Most cybersecurity programs don't fail because the team didn't care. They fail because nobody built an actual program, right? We started buying tools and didn't actually understand the business, chased compliance, thinking that was all we had to do, and didn't actually think about risk. So, in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to build an actual cybersecurity program, no matter where you are today, from scratch or from where you're existing, right? This is the process I use as a CISO, this is the process I teach. This is the process that I advise with as a consultant, right? It doesn't matter, SMB, mid-market, enterprise, this is the right way to do it, basically. And I'm going to try and do it in under 30 minutes. So let's get started. We are the Keyboard Samurai, podcast about the business of cyber and tech, here to help you or your business improve. Here's your host, Wil Klu. Let's hack into it now. Hey, everybody, welcome back. As always, like and subscribe, all that good stuff. This is something running solo today because this is something that I get asked about a lot, whether it's new people when I'm presenting at a conference or an event, or whether it's just meeting with business leaders and talking about cybersecurity in general. How to actually build a cybersecurity program. How do I build up something so that I know when I spend my money, I'm spending it in the right places, that I'm actually addressing the things that matter, or that I even know what this cybersecurity thing means, right? So I figured we talked about it. I've got my little cheat sheet here that I use for some of my presentations so I don't miss any of the steps. So yeah, let's talk. Like the beginning of it, the very first thing is a lot of us cybersecurity pros forget that we work for a business. We're not working for ourselves. We like to think of ourselves as secret squirrel, awesome people, doing all this really cool stuff in cybersecurity and hunting, stopping the baddies. But at the end of the day, to use my race car analogy, we are the brakes, we are the safety systems on the car, and the car is the business, and the business's job is to win the race, not to spend all their money on the brakes, right? Which is essentially what we are. So if you think of the race and winning as what's the business mission, right? For most organizations, that's going to be generate revenue, make money, serve some constituents, right? It's usually one of those two things. And nobody's in the business of going to work every day and spending all of their money on cybersecurity. So you have to understand the business. And that's going to let you know, all right, well, now that we know what the job is that this company wants to do, that I work for, or that we work for, how do I help make that happen, right? That reframing, and then understanding everything that comes from then on has to be feeding to that business mission. That's going to give you some idea then to the next sort of phase step here, which is what's the culture of the organization? How do they make decisions that matter to them, right? So understanding the business, you can start to look around and see, well, where are they spending money? Where are they investing in new things and innovation in the things that they care about? Is it on the manufacturing shop floor because that's where they make all of their widgets that they sell? Is it on their e-commerce website because that's how they generate all their revenue? Is it on some service website because that's where they're able to take care of their constituents? Right? Is it protecting the client information that they have because they're really concerned and it's very sensitive? Like whatever that is, right? You're going to start to look at it and you'll see, okay, here's what the business cares about. Now I can understand how decisions are made. And you can look historically, or just ask around, like, hey, if we did things this way, like how would you make those decisions? That's going to give you what you need to be able to frame things later on for you. And it's going to help you define what that culture looks like. And it's going to drive into the next part of this, which is the risk appetite. So you'll start to get a feel for, okay, well, you're not doing this. Why? Right? Well, we didn't know about it. Okay, well, then that's just a lack of knowledge, but they may intentionally not be doing something because, we don't feel like that's important. And we understand, if that doesn't happen, right, it's going to be okay. Or if it does happen, it's only going to cost us X dollars, right? So that's where you start getting into the risk appetite thing. Now, taking all of this together, it's going to compound and you're going to get a pretty good idea of like what the business is doing, how they're thinking, what decision-making processes they have. And then again, you'll kind of get that feeling for how they make decisions and how much risk they're going to tolerate. And next thing you need is that baseline, which is Something that a lot of people confuse, right? A lot of organizations think, well, I have to do PCI compliance, so once I do PCI, I'm done. Or I have to do CMMC compliance, so once I do that, I'm done. Compliance really is the floor. And for a lot of organizations, especially those that don't have cybersecurity teams or big cybersecurity teams, forget that. Everything tends to be compliance based. And that really leaves a big gap. So the goal here is to get the baseline at least, right? And then make sure that they understand as you're building out this strategy and you're building out this program that you are defining what is the baseline. It is not the end goal, right? So, like as an example, PCI really only applies to the cardholder environment. And it's great if you have PCI compliance. And in fact, a lot of, once you get it kind of sorted out, it's really not that big of a deal. But leaders in the business may not understand that, well, it only applies to a certain part of the business. It doesn't, because you're PCI compliant doesn't mean the rest of your business is secure. And that goes the same thing for HIPAA, for CMC. It only applies to the areas that they care about. So the reason we're doing industry compliance at this point, though, is we're going in to build our strategy and start to define our baseline, which means we know how the business operates. We understand how they're going to make decisions, where they're able to accept more risk or maybe have an appetite for risk. And now we know the bare minimum that has to be done. With that state, now you can kind of put together a cybersecurity strategy. And this is something not to get wrapped up in the axles about. Strategy is very high level. And I think a lot of people fail to understand that. And they want to, once they start talking about the strategic things they want to do, they want to start getting into the tactics right away and start tasking things out. And it's really not that complicated. This is just a couple of pages. This doesn't need to be a 300-page tome, right? It's essentially all the information we just talked about. This is the company's mission. This is how cybersecurity is going to support that. Here's how we're going to make decisions about risk. Here's how we're going to evaluate risk, right? We're going to evaluate it based on the things that are important and costs or availability, confidentiality, all that good stuff. And here's the compliance frameworks that we have to be compliant with. And here's the team that's going to support it, right? The strategy is not that complicated. It's laying out the framework for what you're going to actually use to guide the business going forward. So, strategy defined. Now the fun part comes. So kind of taking care of all this bare minimum stuff. Now, before you can do anything in cybersecurity, you have to know what is actually there. And this is where a lot of organizations fail. So you have to have some asset management, asset visibility. Now, the important thing here to note is assets are not just laptops, desktops, printers, servers, right? For so many years of my life advising, I'd be like, hey, do you have an asset inventory? And they'd say, yeah, here's a list of all of our hardware. Yes, that's part of it. But assets include all of your data. They include all of your applications. They include your business processes. And then they should have owners assigned to them. And the owner is not IT, and the owner is not the CISO. The decisions that are going to be made about the HRIS system are not going to be made based on the CISO or the IT manager, right? They're going to assess the risk around those systems. And then they're going to go to the HR lead and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is the money we have to spend to protect, fix, mitigate, whatever. They're going to make the decisions. This business process that exists to get the widget from the factory floor into a box into the supply chain is owned by not the IT people, not the cybersecurity people, right? So that stuff has to be documented, and you have to have that visibility. And the visibility is the important part because you have to know what you're protecting. So this is the second part of this phase, which is the business impact analysis. So understanding what assets exist in the environment, what's most important to the business. Because if you go into an organization today blindly and say, what's most important, and you ask that to say every executive, every director and above, they're probably all going to have different answers, and some may not even be able to answer it. It's important to have that context to be able to say, well, our e-commerce site is critical. It can't go down. Okay, well, what other processes are connected to that e-commerce site? Well, there's 2 back-end databases. There's this over here. There's all of these things that function together to make that site work. Okay, great. Now, when you say critical assets, it's not just that one arbitrary thing that we all kind of know in our head is the website that, the e-commerce site. but also like all of the processes that are connected to it, all of the data that makes that work, all of the people involved in that, right? So now you have this much larger, more informed thing, which you get from mapping out the data flows effectively, right? So data flow mapping is literally just saying what business, okay, this is the e-commerce site. How does it work? Okay. And then usually, and this is something I've learned in my career, is there's usually 3 ways that things work in an organization. There is the way it's documented, if it's documented at all. There's the way management thinks it works, and then there's the way it actually works. And unfortunately, the only way to find out how it actually works is to get the people in the room or on the call to tell you that. Can tell you the number of times I've gone in and assessed an organization, and I'm like, okay, let's look at your credit card environment, your PCI. How's that work? And like, oh, Bob has all of that. You just need to talk to him for 10 minutes. Cool. I get Bob in there. 2 minutes later, he's like, well, Mary has this part. And okay, go get Mary. And then ultimately 15 minutes later, there's 5 people in the room because we're doing all of these offshoot things, and they didn't realize, well, somebody does this through email. We have this one client who has an SFTP server for some reason or whatever. There's all this weird, crazy stuff that exists. And leadership doesn't ever know that, because they shouldn't, right? Things just work at the end of the day. But that hasn't been documented that way, because it was documented. It's like, no, this is the site and this is how it works. So if you don't do that process, what happens is, well, there's a bunch of risk that hides in between all those little cracks. And if you can't identify that risk, and something happens when you go to rebuild it, to recover, or you go to do attack path mapping or exposure management, things like that, like where you're actually going to start mitigating some risks, you're not going to see it. So if you don't have that visibility, you don't have the strong asset management, and you don't do that impact analysis, you're going to lack that. Now, the impact analysis is important because we talked about the assets themselves and understanding how they work actually. The impact analysis is going to be, well, what's most important to the business? Everything is not most important, right? So this is where you will have to think sort of in a continuity standpoint, being like, okay, well, if everything were to blow up today, what would be the first things we'd need to have? Okay, well, we need that e-commerce site back. Well, okay, how do we get that back? Okay, well, we need these people to be able to get access to this thing over here and this cloud over there, and then these servers and this communication system and this process and these databases. And then what happens is, now you have an order of operations based on the very first thing we talked about, the business mission, right? What it is the company cares about. Because if everything goes away, the goal is to be operational again as soon as possible. And you can only do that if you know which things are most important. Now, it's not just about knowing what's important so you can recover it in order. As the security professional, as the leader in that organization, that's going to give you the fuel, the firepower, the common sense to be able to say, hey, this is the most important thing, or one of the most important things to our organization, and we're not doing enough to protect it, right? This is the reason behind the business impact analysis. This is the reason that you need to have asset visibility, and you need to be able to know where the data flows are all going and understand the business processes. Because if you don't have that, it's going to be really hard to make that argument. You're just kind of pulling it arbitrarily out of the air. So by saying, hey, this is important, and look, we've documented it, we knew that, executives, board people, you all are in agreement that these are the 3 things super most important to us. And, potentially this thing goes, this device on the shop floor goes down, we start losing $100,000 an hour. But we can spend $500,000 this year to make that a very minute chance of ever happening, because it'll be, very well protected and very resilient. Or we can leave it and just accept the fact that that happens, and know that it's going to take at least 72 hours for it to be restored if something happens based on our. So again, having that knowledge, being able to tie it back to the business, that's how you're going to get the fuel to make the decisions to build the program that you need to build. Okay, so we have we have our assets, we have our data flow, we have our impact analysis, we understand what's important, we know what compliance requirements are there. The next thing we have to do is evaluate the risk. Now, this is where you can spend too much time or not enough time very easily, right? Um, the easiest, I mean, and the simplest, least expensive way to do it that may be a little time consuming is having your internal team just kind of, again, leveraging that impact analysis and then kind of looking at the common threats and the things that sit out there in the world. Um, and saying, okay, well, what's the likelihood that this thing can go down? So, you can kind of apply the ransomware theory to everything. You can look at your common threats. You've got, if you're looking at applications and you're going to look at your OWASP stuff. But essentially, you need to look at each of those assets. You need to look at those critical business processes and figure out, all right, what's at risk here? What could be taken down? And then you have to look at there are the common things that all kind of apply to it. Again, ransomware, what kind of data breach, what kind of leakage, like if you've got M&A, what are the chances that there's, some company you bought 5 years ago still has data out there? What are we going to do to, how important is it for us to do attack surface management in that case and kind of look externally, right? Just taking a look at the entire risk landscape and applying it to your business. Once you have this, again, that gives you more fuel, more data. And this is the tricky part because now you're going to quantify things, right? So if you try to do a risk assessment and you don't understand the assets and the data flow and you don't understand what's important to the company, there's no way to say, well, this is what this asset is worth, or what this data is worth, or what the potential impact could be. Because you could be like, well, if we lose this database, it's a bunch of PII, and now we have a bunch of individuals' information, and sure, we have to pay for breach notifications, and we know what it's going to cost for this and that, and you can look at other people in your industry and kind of put some stuff together. But like, what's the actual impact to the business, right? How important is it to you that you maintain that client trust, or that you now lost some client trust? Those things are very specific to the organization. I had a prospect I talked to one time that was very financially driven, but they knew the number. They were like, we own all of these companies. If one of these companies gets breached, if it doesn't cost us at least X, it doesn't matter to us to have to protect anything, right? Literally, they were just in a position where they could just buy a different company, or just, it didn't matter because nobody knew their name, right? That's a very different situation than when like Target and Home Depot get breached. So understanding all that, getting that risk assessment in place, and then using that to, again, it's helping to drive decisions, right? Now, we have our business mission, we have our appetite, our culture defined, we know what our compliance requirements are. We've done an assessment of our risk. Now we have to figure out where we even are today, right? This is all kind of basic stuff. And honestly, the first few parts to get to the strategy shouldn't take very long, unless your organization is really, really large. Like it's a pretty quick process. The BIA and the asset management part, that can take quite longer, especially if you don't have any tooling. You don't have any kind of tool that can kind of grab that data for you, and you have to interview and do all that stuff. It's going to be time consuming. But once you've got all this, the goal now is, okay, I need to basically, this is where you're going to get ready to design the program itself. So you're going to define a current state, and you're going to do that by taking your industry compliance requirements, so everything that you have to be compliant with, and then you're going to pick another framework. So ISO 27001, NIST CSF, NIST 853, whatever you want to use. I highly, most of the times, NIST CSF and ISO 27001 are kind of where you start. And that really depends on how mature the organization is today and where you may want to go in the future, right? If you're heavily regulated, you're probably going to go with ISO. Especially if you may even potentially seek certification for that at some point. If you're smaller, more complex, less mature, you may do this CSF. Not that anyone is better than the other, it's just different. They're going to hit on all the kind of things you need to anyway, and you're going to apply your industry compliance. So you're going to take your framework. Well, and let me answer this question. Well, why do I need a framework? Well, because it's your map. You're going to build a roadmap, but you can't go on a journey if you don't know where you're going, right? So this whole idea of, well, okay, we need to do things this way, Well, okay, who says so? Why do we need to do things this way? That's what's going to happen. As a security leader, you're going to be like, well, we have to secure X, Y, Z, and Delta and Beta and whatever, and they're going to be like, why? Right now, you have the financials and the criticality to say, well, this is important to the business, but some of the other stuff, and then tying things back into that, like it's going to be, well, this is how we agreed. We talked at the beginning about how we agreed we were going to assess risk. Well, now with this framework, we're agreeing this is how we're going to run the security business, right? So having that map is absolutely essential. Now, so you picked your framework and you got your compliance. Now you just have to assess the organization. You go down the questionnaire. For those who have never done this, I mean, if you read the NIST CSF or the ISO 27001, it's pretty straightforward. It tells you what you have to do. Some of it is I'm not gonna say ambiguous, but kind of like lofty and just up there, like, hey, you need a cybersecurity policy, or you need to have an owner assigned, right? It's not as tactical as a PCI requirement, because it's very much applicable to everybody. It's not just focusing on environments. So there may be some areas where you have to do some research. Most tooling out there, AI, Google, just in general, if there's an area you don't understand, and again, getting with somebody who's done it before, having a strong cybersecurity partner, advisor to come help you with, you should be able to get all these things answered. Going down through there and understanding, okay, what is it today? Like, as an example, I think ISO 27001 has several questions on, do you have asset management, right? Is it documented? Is executive team agreed upon it, right? So having all of that stuff is going to tell you, all right, this is what I have to do. Now you will assess the organization against it. So you'll go down each of those things. All right, how are we monitoring our security, or the security of our networks? That's going to be a question on there. Do we have a security policy? Yep. And then, to varying degrees of analysis and validation, you're going to assess it. The goal here is to understand exactly where you are today and then define where you want to be. Now, that defining where you want to be depends. If we go back to the beginning, what's the mission of the business? What's the risk appetite to the business? Where do the risks actually lie? That's all going to define things. So in a maturity scale of 1 to 5, you do not need to be a 5 in every single category. You may only need to be a 2 or a 3 in some areas. You're going to have areas that don't apply, right? If you don't have any in-house development, there's no custom applications and things like that, then you don't have a DevOps or DevSecOps. You don't have application security, SDLC. Like, there's NAs. So, and that, how you define that decision is going to be kind of back to the strategy and the things we talked about at the beginning. What's important to the business? How important is this one aspect of the framework to us? How much does it apply to the important parts of our business? All of that good stuff. You'll finally agree to whatever that is, those goals at the different levels, right? So like, as an example, identity and access management would be a category. And after you do all of your assessments, you may find that you're a 1.5 to, say you're a 1.5, and you want to drive to a 3, because that's what everybody agrees on. We want to have this kind of automated, repeatable stuff, maybe potentially happening, things like that. So that gap is now going to drive, well, what do we need to do to get from a 1 to a 3, or 1.5 to a 3? Well, okay, we're going to have to upgrade these systems, or we're going to have to, get a governance tool in place. We're going to have to hire some people. We're going to have to build a process, improve a process, whatever that may be. And most of the times, those gaps that you're pushing, if it's anything more than like a 0.5 point, like if you have no disaster recovery plan today, then you're at a 0. Like, just getting to a 1 or a 2 is going to be a lot more than just buy a backup tool, right? You're going to have to document things. You're going to have to go back to, you're going to have to start testing things. I mean, there's like a whole lot that you're going to have to do. And that may take months to even longer, right? So a lot of times that gap between wherever you are and where you're going to be could be one project in 6 months. It could be 10 projects in 18 months, right? Until you get down to it, you won't know. But what that does is those gaps are going to say, okay, here's all the things we have to do to drive us from our current state to the desired state that we want to be in. Now you have almost a roadmap. Technically, on paper, you have a roadmap. You're like, hey, here's where we are. Here's where we want to go. This is what we're going to do. The next part, which is kind of the last part, is you have to get budget and you have to get buy-in, because I can almost guarantee you that whatever your current state, desired state is, you can't afford to do all of it, at least not right now. So that's where you start to have these conversations. So you're going to talk to whoever your budget approvers are. You're going to put together, this is where you're going to put together proposals and have conversations with other people about, hey, these are the risks. This is how we want to deal with it. This is why it's important. And there's going to be, and how that gets done is going to vary very, very much depending on your organization. So a lot of times, as the security leader, you will have to go and talk to other leaders and be like, hey, look, I'm over here talking to the CFO because the finance system has got a lot of really bad vulnerabilities in it, or we really see a potential risk around it. I'm going to explain that to them first and kind of get them on board and help them see it and understand it. It's not something you want to show up to a board meeting and everybody's there and then flame the CFO for his stuff being out of shape and saying, hey, we need to fix it all. They're not going to get your support. So this is sort of the political part of it as well, right? Building all that out, sorting all that out, getting people to buy in, and then figuring out, all right, what do you actually get budget for? So I've done this a lot in my past, where I have key clients that I would go and visit with every year, and I would sit in the room with the CISO and their team, and they would basically talk through the roadmap that the CISO is going to take to the board and say, hey, these are the things that we've done the assessments on. This is the roadmap we're doing. And me as the advisor there, I would just be like, okay, well, that project you have there, you've got it for 6 months. I think it's probably going to take 12 because we're seeing in the industry, or like whatnot. This other project you have there, do you know what it's going to cost? If you don't, I can get some of my people to talk to you and give you an idea. So you're not going in there just guessing a number. And then other things be like, well, you said that's a priority. Why is that a priority? Oh, well, did you think about X, Y, and Z? Because this other thing actually might be more important for you guys, right? Getting that sort of third party outside look. But I say all that because we would do that because this is the CISO's goal. Like he was like, hey, this is the roadmap. This is what I want budget for the next 12 months. And we're there to help. And then he would go and he would present it to the board, and then we'd come back and we'd kind of have that same meeting all over again. And he'd be like, okay, this is what we have budget for now. You know, out of the 30 items that we wanted to accomplish this year, we're only going to have enough, we're only going to have X amount of money. I think we can do like 20 of them. Or, we can do we can do, 25 of them and like a little bit of these other 5 and little pieces, and put that, and then we're reshuffling it all and figuring out, well, okay, now that we know how much money we have, what's actually the most important? And this process is very long. Like this is, again, depending on where you're at. Like if you're a large enterprise, this is going to take a while. If you're a small business, it may be pretty easy to do. I will say the nice thing about working with smaller and mid-market businesses is the solutions are the same. So the problem is the problem, the solution's the solution. But when the organization's smaller, it's usually a lot easier to get things done. But that doesn't make the cost smaller always. So you have to look at that. So once you have your budget, once you have your buy-in, you've got it all sorted out. You okay, cool. Now you have your roadmap. Now you can go, here's the money we have. Here's our current state. Here's the desired state we're driving towards. Let's start assigning resources. And then that's how you build the program, right? You've started this all from the business mission. You've taken the culture, the understanding of how decisions are made. You've defined the risk appetite for them. You've got all the industry compliance, the baseline for this is the bare minimum that we have to do from a security standpoint. And we now have a strategy that we're moving forward with. We've assessed the impact of all of the systems, right? We understand what assets we have, what data we have, what business processes exist. We know what's important, what's less important. We know where the risks lie. We know where ransomware is going to be, how it's going to impact the business. We know how a SQL injection is going to impact this. If that were to happen, we've kind of looked at all of these different things, and we have an understanding of where the risk lies. So we can now start to focus budget. We've defined, we've chosen a framework that we're going to operate against while incorporating our industry compliance. We've assessed ourselves against that. We've defined the things we need to do better and how we're going to mature over time. And to be clear, that desired end state is not where we're going to get to in 1 year. That is where we want to get to as a business. So it may take 3-4 years to get to that desired state, depending on what it is. Or you may change that decision later at some point and be like, you know what, I think we're mature enough, or, oh, no, we need to drive more maturity. But the point is, you have a roadmap now because you have budget and you know where you're going. Now you start building out these programs. Now you start looking at your disaster recovery program, your vulnerability management program. You start looking at your security monitoring program, your asset visibility, your exposure management, all of the things that you have to do. There are all of these subsequent programs underneath the big overarching program that you're going to build. And that's pretty much how you do it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time. I hope this was super useful to you. As again, like and subscribe. Thanks. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. Follow Wil and the podcast on LinkedIn /Wil Klu. Visit Wil Klu ME for information on services he offers to help your cyber or tech business grow. Until next time, Synaculator.